Welcome to Storyscapes, where life's twists and turns take center stage and the line between laughter and heartbreak blurs in the most deliciously unexpected ways. Buckle up, dear listener, because sometimes realizing and finding out is just the beginning. The evening started with a sense of nostalgia so thick you could choke on it. Edenvale High's class of 2008 reunion was in full swing, with 34-year-olds pretending they hadn't spent the last decade stressing over bonds, babies, and bad bosses. Ruth walked into the hall in a red gown that said, "I'm not here to reminisce, I'm here to conquer." But as the night unfolded, Ruth came to realize that no gown, no matter how stunning, could shield her from the sharp sting of betrayal. Ruth wasn't one of those people who clung to high school memories. I mean, sure, she enjoyed the occasional trip down memory lane, but her life was way too full, too complicated to dwell on yearbooks and old crushes. That's why she was surprised when her best friend from those years, Mbali, insisted that she come to the reunion. "It'll be fun," Mbali promised, her voice as warm and convincing as always. And so Ruth walked in. She walked in holding Nati's hand, her husband of 8 years, barely noticing how clammy his palm felt. Her heels clicked confidently on the floor as she greeted familiar faces, accepting compliments on how little she'd changed. All the while, Mbali flitted around the room like a butterfly in a sequin dress, the unofficial queen of the night. Everything was perfect until it wasn't. The first crack appeared when Ruth overheard a snippet of laughter near the punch bowl. Two former classmates, women who Ruth barely remembered, were giggling over their drinks like teenagers. "Girl, did you see Mbali and Nati earlier? Still sneaking around like it's high school," one of them whispered, but not quietly enough. "Ugh, it's so messy, oh my gosh," the other added. "I mean, how does Ruth not know? It's been years." The words hit Ruth like a brick to the chest. At first she thought she'd misheard, that maybe she drank a cocktail way too quickly. But then when she looked across the room and saw Mbali laughing at something Nati had said, his hand briefly grazing her arm, her stomach dropped. Ruth tried to brush it off, tried to tell herself that it was nothing. But the longer the night dragged on, the more the puzzle pieces she hadn't known she was assembling began falling into place. Mbali and Nati weren't just close. They were too close. Memories she'd buried began resurfacing. Like the time Mbali had showed up uninvited at Ruth and Nati's honeymoon hotel, claiming she just happened to be in the area. The way Nati always knew what Mbali was up to, even when Ruth didn't. Their playful inside jokes between them that Ruth had once found endearing were now suffocating. By the time Ruth excused herself to go to the bathroom, her hands were trembling. She locked herself in a stall, pulled out her phone, and did something she hadn't done in years. She scrolled through Mbali's Instagram page with fresh eyes. At first, it was subtle. A photo of Mbali at the beach Ruth had never been invited to. A suspicious shadow in the corner of a sunset shot. One that looked suspiciously like Nati's beer belly. Ruth's heart pounded as she kept scrolling, each post revealing something she'd been too blind to see before. And then she found it. A photo from 6 years ago. Mbali holding a glass of champagne with the caption, "Celebrating true love, forever and always." The date? 2 weeks after Ruth and Nati's wedding. Ruth stared at the screen, her breath shallow, her head spinning. She felt the weight of it all, the lies, the deceit, the mockery of her entire marriage. And just when she thought it couldn't get worse, she actually noticed a comment on the photo from Natty. True love always wins. For a moment, Ruth thought she might cry, but the tears didn't come. Instead, she felt something colder. A hard, steely anger began to take root in her chest. She walked back into the hall, her head held high, her face a mask of calm. Mbali caught her eye and smiled. A big, radiant smile that Ruth now saw for what it truly was, the grin of a thief. It was in that moment that Ruth knew two things. One, her marriage was over. Two, this betrayal would not go unpunished. And so, with a heart shattered but a mind sharper than ever, Ruth left the reunion early, telling Natty that she had a headache. She wasn't lying. She did have a headache. It was the kind of headache that came when every lie you've ever ignored suddenly screams at you, all at once. By the time she got home, Ruth wasn't thinking about pain anymore. She was thinking about revenge, because sometimes realizing and finding out isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning. When Ruth got home that night, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at her wedding photo on the wall. She and Natty looked so happy in that picture, flanked by their bridal party. Mbali, of course, had been her maid of honor, standing close enough to Ruth in the photos to smell her bouquet. Ruth wondered how Mbali had kept a straight face that day, knowing that what she was doing with Natty behind her back was already happening. The betrayal was outrageous, but Ruth, she wasn't gonna let it break her. No, she was not a victim. She was a strategist, and if Mbali and Natty thought they could humiliate her, they had no idea who they were dealing with. So she poured herself a glass of wine and began planning. First, Ruth needed ammunition. The emails between Mbali and Natty weren't enough. She needed proof that would burn their reputations to ash. Over the next week, Ruth played the role of the oblivious wife to perfection. She smiled at Natty's lame jokes, went to yoga with Mbali, and even posted a throwback photo of the three of them with the caption, "True friendships never fade." Behind the scenes, Ruth was on a mission. She bought a recorder, hiding it in her handbag whenever she met Mbali. She started accidentally leaving the phone on the counter with a voice memo app running when Natty was at home. And when Natty fell asleep on the couch one night, she took his fingerprint to unlock his phone, forwarding every incriminating text and photo to herself. By the end of the week, Ruth had a collection of dirt so comprehensive, it could not ruin only their relationship, but their lives. Next, Ruth decided to mess with their heads. Mbali prided herself on being unshakable, always calm, always poised. But Ruth knew everyone had a breaking point. One afternoon, Ruth sent Mbali an anonymous bouquet of flowers with a note that read, "I know about him. Sleep well." The next day, she left an unsigned card on Mbali's car windshield. It said, "Some secrets should stay buried. Unfortunately, yours won't." Mbali started avoiding Ruth's calls, claiming she was too busy to meet for lunch. Ruth pretended to be hurt, but she knew the truth. Mbali was unraveling. Natty, on the other hand, was way easier to rattle. Ruth began dropping subtle hints like casually asking, "Do you think people always get what they deserve?" Or, "Isn't it funny how lies always come out in the end?" She enjoyed watching him squirm. his eyes darting around like a man trapped in a burning building. Finally, it was time for the grand finale. Ruth invited Mbali and Nati over for dinner under the guise of wanting to rebuild their friendship. They both hesitated, but Ruth insisted. "We're family," she said. "I don't want anything to come between us," she said sweetly. The night of the dinner, Ruth pulled out all the stops. She cooked lamb, Mbali's favorite, and set the table with the china from her wedding. The dessert was a cheesecake Mbali adored, but with one key addition: a generous dose of laxatives. The evening started innocently enough. Ruth played the perfect hostess, pouring wine, making small talk, but as the night went on, she began dropping bombshells disguised as casual remarks. "Mbali, remember that beach trip? Funny how Nati couldn't stop talking about it when he got home." "Nati, do you remember our honeymoon? Oh wait, you were texting Mbali the whole time, weren't you?" The tension in the room grew thicker than the gravy on the lamb. Nati stammered. Mbali's smile faltered. But Ruth? She kept pouring wine, pretending not to notice. By the time dessert arrived, Mbali and Nati were visibly uncomfortable. The cheesecake sat untouched on their plates, and Ruth could practically smell the fear radiating off them. She clinked her wineglass gently, drawing their attention. "I have a little surprise for both of you," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. Mbali chuckled nervously. "Oh, no, Ruth, you didn't have to." "Oh, but I did," Ruth said. She stood up and walked to the living room, returning holding a laptop, which she placed at the center of the table. "I made a little slideshow. It's about us." Ruth clicked play. The first image was innocent enough, a wedding photo of Ruth and Nati smiling and glowing in the happiness. Then came a photo of Mbali and Nati standing a little too close at Ruth's bachelorette party. The next slide was a screenshot of one of Mbali's and Nati's texts. "You looked so good last night. I wish I could have kissed you properly. Ruth would have killed us." Then came more screenshots, photos, emails, voice memos, every dirty little secret Ruth had uncovered, laid out in a presentation so damning it could have been used in a court of law. The room was silent, except for the click of the slides advancing. Ruth watched as Nati's face turned ashen and Mbali's hands flew to her mouth, her sequin composure finally shattering. "Ruth," Nati started, his voice hoarse. I can explain." "Please, don't bother," Ruth interrupted, her tone icy. "You said enough. But don't worry, I'm not keeping this masterpiece to myself." She clicked again, revealing the final slide. "Emailing to everyone we know." Mbali gasped. "Ruth, you wouldn't." "Wouldn't I?" Ruth smiled. "You see, I'm done being the fool. If my life's going to be a soap opera, I might as well be the one writing it." Mbali jumped up, knocking over her wineglass. "Ruth, please, let's talk about this. Talk." Ruth's laughter was cold. "That's rich coming from you." As the slideshow ended, Ruth closed the laptop with a snap. She leaned in, her voice low and sharp. "I trusted you, Mbali. I trusted both of you. But now I'm done." The final act of Ruth's revenge was swift and spectacular. She hit send on the email the next morning, ensuring every mutual friend, colleague, and nosy neighbor got the full story. Mbali's carefully curated image as a poised, perfect socialite crumbled overnight, and Nati's career took a nosedive as his colleagues learned of his indiscretions. Ruth, on the other hand, emerged stronger. She filed for divorce, blocked both Nati and Mbali, and booked herself a solo trip to Zanzibar. Because sometimes realizing and finding out isn't just the end of a whole chapter, it's the start of a whole new book. And so, dear listeners, the moral of this story is simple. If you're going to betray someone, make sure they're not smarter, craftier, and more tech-savvy than you. Because while love might be blind, revenge always has a perfect vision. Stay tuned for the next episode of Storyscapes, where the drama continues, the laughter is dark, and the stories are always unforgettable. Thanks for tuning into Storyscapes. I'd love to hear what you thought about today's story. Please drop a comment and let's chat. If you enjoyed it, be sure to subscribe and share it with a friend. Please come back for our next adventure. Until then, keep imagining.